For 12 years, I stood just a few steps behind her, not close enough to speak, not far enough to pretend I didn't hear. I watched Princess Margaret enter rooms where smiles froze the moment she arrived. I watched courtiers lower their voices, not out of respect, but caution. And I watched a woman born into privilege slowly realize that forgiveness in the House of Windsor is never guaranteed. I was her protection, but I was never her ally. When the public thinks of Princess Margaret, they remember glamour. The cigarettes held just a little too confidently, the laughter that carried too loudly through palace corridors, the scandals, whispered, exaggerated, endlessly repeated. But what they never saw was what came after the headlines faded. Because the palace did not punish Margaret loudly, it punished her quietly. In royal households, silence is a weapon. No official reprimand, no exile announced to the press, just doors that stopped opening, invitations that never arrived, decisions made without her name on the paper, and I was there for all of it. There was a morning, I remember it clearly, when she was scheduled to attend a private family luncheon. She dressed carefully, not extravagantly, not defiantly. Hope, even then, had become something she handled with caution. At the last moment, a message arrived. The luncheon had been rescheduled. No explanation, no apology. She read the note once, then again. She didn't cry. She simply handed it back and said quietly, "I see." That was the moment I understood. This was no longer about love, or duty, or even forgiveness. This was about control. The palace has many ways of reminding you where you stand. Princess Margaret had crossed lines no one was meant to see. Not because she was cruel, but because she was human in a family that demanded restraint above all else. And the price she paid was not public disgrace. It was something far more enduring. Loneliness. Over the next 12 years, I watched her become careful in ways she never had to be before. Every remark measured, every smile calculated, every silence heavier than the last. She was still royal, but she was no longer trusted. In this story, I am not here to defend her, nor am I here to condemn her. I am here because I saw what the palace never admitted. Princess Margaret was not destroyed by scandal. She was undone by something far colder. The palace's refusal to forget. And in part 2, I will tell you what she did that the palace truly never forgave. Not the rumors, not the headlines, but the quiet betrayal that changed everything. There is a misunderstanding the public still clings to. People believe the palace punished Princess Margaret for who she loved, for how loudly she lived, for embarrassing headlines. That is not true. The palace had endured scandal before. It knew how to wait them out. What it could not tolerate was disobedience without remorse. The decision that sealed her fate was not impulsive. It was deliberate. And worse, it was public. By the time she made it, Margaret already understood the rules. She had grown up watching her sister become queen. She had seen duty harden into law. She knew exactly what was expected of her, and she chose calmly and consciously to step outside it. Not in secret, not in shame, but in full view of the institution that raised her. I remember the weeks that followed. Nothing dramatic happened at first. No raised voices, no angry summons, just a shift in tone. Meetings where her presence was no longer required. family discussions where decisions were already finalized, a subtle but unmistakable recalibration of distance. The palace does not confront, it withdraws. From my position, I could see the change before she fully felt it. Doors that once opened without question now required confirmation. Staff who once deferred now hesitated, waiting for signals from higher above. And the most telling sign of all, she was no longer warned. In the royal family, warnings are a privilege. They mean you still matter enough to be corrected. Margaret stopped receiving them. One afternoon, after a small private engagement had been quietly removed from her schedule, she asked a single question. Was this decided today? The answer was no. It had been decided days earlier. No one thought to tell her. That was the palace's verdict. Not exile, not disgrace, irrelevance. People often say Margaret rebelled, but rebellion suggests chaos. What she did was far more dangerous. She asserted choice, and she did so knowing the cost. I watched her accept that cost in stages. At first she dismissed it. Then she joked about it. Then, much later, she stopped asking questions altogether. Silence became her shield, not because she agreed, but because she finally understood the game was no longer hers to play. What the palace never forgave was not scandal. It was precedent. If Margaret could choose herself over the institution and survive, then others might follow. That possibility was unacceptable. And so, quietly, efficiently, without cruelty or mercy, the palace closed ranks. In Part 3, I will explain how the punishment worked, not through cruelty, but through omission. How a princess can remain inside the palace and still be completely alone. If you expect cruelty, you won't find it here. There were no shouting matches, no ultimatums, no dramatic confrontations behind closed doors. The palace is far more sophisticated than that. It doesn't destroy you. It simply stops including you. I watched this happen to Princess Margaret in ways the public would never notice. Her name disappeared from drafts before schedules were finalized. Her opinion was no longer requested, only tolerated when unavoidable. Her presence became ceremonial rather than essential. She was still invited, but she was no longer consulted. In royal life, this distinction is everything. Consultation means influence. Invitation means obligation. Margaret was reduced to the latter. One evening, after a small gathering had ended, she lingered longer than usual in an antechamber. No one joined her, not because they disliked her, but because they did not know whether they were allowed to. That uncertainty is how the palace enforces distance. No instructions are given. Everyone simply learns to read the temperature. Staff noticed it first. Conversations paused when she entered. Jokes softened. Opinions disappeared. Not out of fear, out of caution. And Margaret noticed, too. At first, she filled the silence herself. She spoke more, laughed louder, commanded attention where it was no longer freely given. But that only accelerated the withdrawal. The palace does not argue. It waits. Over time, she adjusted. She became quieter, sharper, more contained. The woman known for excess learned restraint, not because she wanted to, but because resistance no longer yielded results. What the public interpreted as bitterness was actually awareness. Margaret understood something most never do. That power in the palace is not about rank. It is about access. and hers had been quietly restricted. I remember a moment, brief, unremarkable to anyone else, that captured it perfectly. She arrived for a family engagement and asked a simple logistical question. No one answered, not because they couldn't, but because the decision had already been made elsewhere, without her. She nodded, said nothing, and never asked again. That was the true punishment, not loneliness imposed, but relevance removed. In part 4, I will tell you how this silence followed her into her private life, how it shaped her friendships, her habits, and the isolation that no title could protect her from. There is a particular kind of loneliness that only exists inside institutions. It is not caused by absence. It is caused by proximity without connection. That was the loneliness that settled around Princess Margaret in her later years. From the outside, nothing appeared to change. She lived in beautiful residences. She attended engagements. She was photographed, titled, acknowledged. But privately, the circle around her grew smaller, not because people left, but because fewer were allowed in. Friends noticed it before the public did. Invitations declined. Calls returned later, or not at all. Moments of warmth followed by sudden withdrawal. Margaret was learning a new discipline, emotional self-containment. She stopped trusting continuity. If someone was kind today, she did not assume they would be tomorrow. If a door opened briefly, she did not rush through it. Experience had taught her that access was temporary and conditional. What many mistook for indulgence was coping. Long evenings, excessive habits, a deliberate blurring of hours, not defiance, numbness. She spoke less about the family. When she did, it was never bitter, only precise, as if she had learned that emotion only complicated things that were already settled. I once overheard her say, almost casually, "One must learn not to expect consistency." It was not a complaint. It was a conclusion. The palace did not forbid her from forming connections. It simply made them fragile. Anyone close to her eventually felt the pressure, not explicit, but understood. Remain neutral, remain discreet, remain temporary. And so, slowly, she learned to rely on herself. Not because she preferred it, but because it was safer. The tragedy of Princess Margaret was never scandal. It was compression. A woman of intensity forced into emotional minimalism. A personality too large for a system that values containment above all else. She still smiled in public, still played her role, still carried the name. But privately, she had already stepped back, conserving what little autonomy remained. By the time age began to weigh on her, the isolation no longer shocked her. It had become familiar, predictable, almost orderly. And yet, near the end, there was something she did not expect, something the palace could not control. In part 5, I will tell you what she said when the circle was at its smallest, when titles no longer mattered, and silence finally broke. In the end, there were very few people left in the room. Not because Princess Margaret had been abandoned, but because the palace, by design, leaves no room for sentiment. Titles remain. Rituals continue. But intimacy fades. By then, she no longer spoke about forgiveness. Not hers. Not theirs. She had moved beyond that. Her health had become fragile, but her clarity had sharpened. There was no bitterness in her voice, only accuracy. She understood, perhaps better than anyone, how the system worked, and she no longer resisted it. One evening, long after the household had quieted, she said something I never forgot. It was not dramatic, it was not confessional, it was almost instructional. "They didn't punish me," she said. "They simply decided I no longer mattered." She paused, then added, "That is how it's done. There is no anger in it, only recognition." The public remembers Princess Margaret as tragic, flamboyant, difficult. What they rarely consider is this: she was not undone by excess. She was undone by awareness. She saw the limits of affection inside the institution and lived long enough to understand the consequences of crossing them. The palace never forgave her, not because she was disloyal, but because she demonstrated something dangerous, that a royal could choose differently and survive. Her final years were not filled with reconciliation. There were no dramatic apologies, no formal restoration, just continuity. The same quiet distance that had defined her middle years. And yet, there was dignity in how she carried it. She did not beg for relevance. She did not seek absolution. She simply remained. When she died, the palace mourned her properly, ceremonially, respectfully, correctly. But the true story had already ended years earlier. In the moment she realized that forgiveness was not part of the system, only order. This is not a story of rebellion. It is a story of limits and of what happens when someone reaches them. Some were born to serve the crown. Others were born too close to see it clearly. Princess Margaret was both.